Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my Alice in Wonderland project. Yes, I said part 2, so don't say I didn't warn you. There should be a link to part 1 in the description below if you want to go see me make the corset of my project. But maybe you're just here to watch me make a tutu, or some chiffon flowers, or a little bit of embroidery. Right, I think it's going to be best if we just go straight into this video.
First, I went straight into making the tutu, so I basically had to make a circle skirt, which meant I had to use pi, as in the maths pi, not the food. To get the calculations to do this, I started with my waist measurement, which I'm not disclosing because I'm a woman and we do not discuss our weight or sizes. And then I divided my waist measurement by 3.14. I rounded that measurement to the first decimal, and I didn't need to add any seam allowance because I folded my fabric in quarters so there won't be any seams, but if you do it, add seam allowance when doing the calculation. So, anyway, back to the video. This is me marking that measurement on my fabric, forming a quarter circle, and then I added 7 inches to that because that's the width I wanted for my tutu. Then I cut this out. By the way, the fabric I'm using is the red cotton I used for the lining of my corset. Next, I cut out my waistband piece, which was 6 centimeters in width in red cotton, and I later cut it out again in white satin too. After, I cut out another circle skirt for my tutu out of calico, and I did this in the same way as I did it for the red cotton. I decided to do this so the tutu would be stronger. I did this all over again with the white satin, which was harder than the last 2 times because the fabric is annoyingly slippery, so I put a few pins in before marking it and cutting it out. I swear, that's the last layer of my tutu. So I had my red cotton that would be underneath, then my calico, then my satin on top, along with my 2 waistband pieces. I decided to top stitch over all 3 layers of the tutu on the outside and inside rings, so it would be easier to handle down the line. After this, I had to cut the tutu so I'll be able to get into it later on. Next, it was time to bind around the outside of the tutu. I had already made this white satin binding for my corset before, and luckily I had plenty left over so I didn't have to make any more. I eased this binding around the whole tutu. Now, I had to fold the binding over to the other side of the tutu, so I secured it with pins first and then sewed it all down. Afterwards, I had to pin my waistband in place. However, I might have hit a tiny problem. The waistband was kind of short, an amateur mistake, so let's ignore it please. I fixed this by cutting out an extra piece of fabric and adding it onto the end. Shh! No one will ever know because it's all at the back and it will all be hidden. Then I sewed the waistband in place. Next, I had to mark the boning channels for the tutu, which there'll only be 2 of. I only marked 1 line and then sewed along this line. Then I sewed about 1.5 centimetres away from that line so I know the boning will fit in later. I just eyeball rather than marking, but don't do this, you should mark it, ignore me, I cheat all the time. I sew 1.5 centimetres away from the binded edge of the tutu to create the second boning channel. I know the satin is wrinkling and I know I could fix that, but is there really any point when it's all going to be covered up anyway? So, here is the tutu so far, and I went ahead and binded one of the raw opening edges the same way I did the outer edge of the tutu. I also pinned the waistband to the other side of the tutu ready to hand sew in place. After this, I measured the outer and inner boning channels so I know how much boning to cut later on. I minus 2.5 centimetres from this measurement because the 5mm is for the binded opening in the tutu, and the 2 centimetres is leaving room to put more boning in along the opening so it is strengthened when wearing the tutu. Now, before I put the boning in, I feel I should show you my failed mock-up of the tutu because I made a few hideous mistakes and it turned out very twisty and completely wrong. So I turned to my costuming group and they told me how to fix it. I reduced the circumference of the tutu, I will use metal boning instead of plastic boning, and I only added 1 channel to my mock-up, but I am doing 2 in my real one. So, I next measure the boning out, which I marked ready to cut with what I believe are bolt cutters. No small pliers this time, metal boning requires some heavy duty equipment, so I may have borrowed it from across the road, because why would I own anything like that? After, I cut pieces of duct tape off to wrap around the ends of the boning because they are quite sharp and I don't want it ripping through the fabric, so the duct tape acts as a cushion. Next, it was time to insert the boning into both channels. I pushed it through the calico and red cotton layer rather than the satin and calico layer, just because the satin is more delicate. My camera is full, so it's downloading onto my computer, so while it's doing that I'm going to bind the other edge too. After, I marked 2 centimetres away from the binded openings of the tutu, ready to pin the boning channels along the sides, so it's nice and sturdy. I turned one end of the channel over so the boning won't slip out, but obviously leave the other open so I can actually put the boning in. Then I sew the channel to the tutu, making sure to only sew at the edges so the boning can still go in afterwards. Now it was the whole process of preparing boning again, except I just used plastic boning instead of metal. I measured, I cut, I sanded and I inserted. I can't really be bothered with the instructions all over again. I quickly folded under the edge of the boning channel and hand sewed the ends closed to keep the boning in there. Next, I decided to use press studs as the closures to my tutu, so I sewed 5 along the edge of my closure in the tutu, evenly spaced, and I included 1 in the waistband. Now comes the fun part of adding all the cards to my tutu, and there are a lot of them. I think I went through 3 packs of cards. I started the first layer by adding them up to the second boning channel, and they hang slightly off the edge. I applied the hot glue to the card before putting it on the tutu, and then put more on after pressing it down at the top so I was satisfied it was secure. I also used my sewing machine tweezers to press the cards down because it turns out plastic is quite hot with hot glue on it, and my hands are very sensitive. I know sewers everywhere will be cringing at me for using hot glue to put them onto the beautiful white satin, but the cards are plastic covered. I'd go through loads of needles blunting them, and it would take me ages to sew the cards on, so no judgment please. Unfortunately, my camera battery ran out while I was doing the second layer of cards, but I did it in the same way as the first layer, just along the second boning channel, which I think was a good choice. I just kept going around the tutu until I had reached 4 layers of cards, and then I decided to stop until I knew how many roses I wanted to add to the tutu later on. After this, I cut out lots of strips of red and white chiffon of varying lengths and widths to start making the roses for my costume. I started sewing these strips in half on the bias so it wasn't completely straight, which is what you want to achieve so the roses look better when you come to making them. I just used my pinking shears to cut a corner off the strip to make it so I could sew on the bias, a good trick I learnt. Now it was time to assemble the roses for the costume. I cut off the messy end of the rose and glued it down so it is hidden. Try not to get hot glue on your hands, believe me, it hurts and it's messy. Then I started wrapping the fabric up and gluing as I went along. Hopefully you can see why I sewed the fabric on the bias, because as I go around the roses start to form and the fabric pops out more organically so it looks slightly more realistic. I know I could have sewn these, but this process took forever and it would have taken even more time to hand sew them together, so I cheated and used hot glue yet again. When I got to the other end of the fabric strip, I cut off the messy end again and glued it over so no raw edges poked out, and then I used the end of the strip to bring it underneath the rose to cover the underside of it. Now do this process for all of the fabric strips until it drives you so insane that you want to stop the project, or bang your head against the wall, or complain about it to anyone you're talking to, because that's what I did for days on end. So, I had roses now. So many roses. It might not look like a lot, but you didn't make them so you don't get an opinion, nor did you burn your hands 1,000 times with the glue gun messing around with chiffon. Before I started placing these roses, I switched back to my corset and quickly embroidered the quote that inspired this whole project. I got some embroidery floss and just followed my marks. I'm not the best at embroidering, but it will do. I didn't film much of it, but here's the results afterwards. Next, I started placing the roses. I put my corset and tutu on my mannequin and started to put the roses on the corset first. When I liked the placement of a rose, I pinned it in place, trying to get different sizes in different places to mix it in. Like in my original design, I wanted the roses to cascade down from the strap of my corset and then go out onto the tutu. I wanted red roses where the red satin was and white roses where the white satin was on the back, mimicking the roses that haven't yet been painted. However, I decided that I didn't like just the red at the front or just the white at the back. It looks better mixed up, so I took some of the roses and switched them round. Now it was time to secure the roses in place, and I can hear the screams of sewers everywhere again, because this time I am directly applying hot glue to both the chiffon and the satin. It's the third time I chose to use glue in this project, and I have to say, I'm quite ashamed of myself for this, but I was on a strict deadline that I had imposed on myself, and this seemed like the best option. But I understand if you want to judge me this time. I am too. Nevertheless, I powered on through and glued the roses in place one at a time, trying to keep the placement right. Lastly, I filled in the remaining white space on my tutu with more cards now that I knew I had my roses where I wanted them. I also covered up the closures of my tutu with cards so I was still able to get in and out of my tutu, but it was more hidden. I also added 3 cards glued together, and I put these on top of my strap of the corset. And that was it. Here's me all dressed up in the costume before my photo shoot, messing around, feeling very giddy that it was finally finished and spinning around like a clumsy ballerina. So, like always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the progress of the costumes I make, you can always go to my Instagram, which the link is in the description below. Bye!